Good morning, and thank you for joining us. We're here to talk to you today about implementing a transformative agreement between Cambridge University Press and the University of California. And I think I'll let everybody introduce themselves as they speak. I'm Rice Majors from the University of California, Davis. And let's go to the next slide. Before we get into the meat of today's presentation, I just want to level the playing field and make sure that everybody has a working understanding of the contours of the transformative agreement that Cambridge University Press and University of California have. Right. We're in a 3-year contract here that has moved us to a read and publish agreement, this is the contours of it are based on the amount that we were spending, that we, the University of California, were spending with Cambridge prior to this agreement. And this basically will have a sliding bar where the reading fee will decrease as we publish more with Cambridge, or as more of our authors take advantage of the terms of the contract. This is currently covering about 80% of Cambridge's journals, so Cambridge handles a lot of society journals that aren't yet at a point where they might have an open access option available, and Cambridge is working with the remainder of their title list to try to get to 100%. UC has some, I don't know if they're unique to us, but unusual so far ideas in terms of how we might implement this with our authors on campus. So a lot of authors do have access, in the UC system, do have access to some pretty good research funds that allow them and sometimes require them to publish open access. For 2019, the libraries are going to take our subscription savings and offset the entirety of article processing fees. And in 2020, we're going to move to a cost-sharing model where the libraries would pay a certain amount of an APC, and we'd ask the authors to pay the remainder if they have research funds, and if they don't, the libraries will pay the entirety of it. So it would be a little bit discipline specific how that would play out. And we also maintain that authors have the option to opt out. There are lots of good reasons to publish open access. That's a whole nother talk. But we want to maintain that our authors do have that academic freedom. And I bring this up because the contours of how UC is approaching this impact the implementation. So what we are going to talk about today are how we got to an agreement. So starting with the mission and the philosophy of these two institutions and how we came together to talk those out, how we got to the point of having an agreement, and then where kind of some really interesting work began of getting from that agreement into something that was implemented and live for our authors, which it is today. And then where we're going to go from here, and then we're going to also try to translate this into action items for all of you, whether you are a publisher or you are a library person.
So I'm Matt Wilmot. I am the Open Access Collection Strategist at the California Digital Library. And I'm going to start by just talking quickly about some of the overall goals and philosophies that we have at UC that are kind of driving our actions here. So I've started by listing the first sentence of the mission of the University of California. And this feels really empowering to me as a librarian because you can see that it talks specifically about transmitting advanced knowledge. And that's really what we as librarians are working on doing, right? And so this has really guided our approach to working with publishers and to moving towards things like transformative agreements. In accordance with these, we've also seen some movement from faculty and from the administration on signaling to us how they'd like us to move towards these things. So each of these sort of items in this list is kind of a landmark thing in and of itself, but taken as a whole, it really gives some guidance to the library about how we should be pursuing moving towards open access in the scholarly communications environment. So we in the libraries have followed suit, and we've taken a lot of initiatives as a result of the direction that we're receiving from our faculty. Some of them are sort of more active, things like implementing our open access policy or publishing journals on our eScholarship platform. Some of them are more sort of research-based, so things like the Pay It Forward report, the Pathways to Open Access report, which help us understand the environment that we're operating in and better develop our strategy moving forward. And of course, that naturally sort of leads into the idea of negotiating for pilot transformative agreements with publishers.
My name is Jennifer Maurer, and I'm one of the library sales managers at Cambridge. And I've been working quite closely with the sort of back-end development of this agreement. So from the Cambridge side, our mission and philosophies, we felt really aligned quite well with CDL in that as a mission-driven university press, we are committed to the development and dissemination of high-quality research, and we see open as a means to accelerate that goal. So it's become a major priority for us to support these pathways to open. We also have strong relationships with authors, and we want to continue to make it easy for them to publish and give them choices about how they want to publish. And finally, I think in the wake of all of this change, we realize that we need to be innovative and flexible in order to continue to support these two goals effectively. So I think that to speak to the priorities and our aligned priorities a little bit more, I think it was about this time last year that we had a handful of read and publish agreements in Europe, and we were keen to start a partnership in the United States. We'll talk a little bit more about timeline later, but we had some initial discussions at Charleston last year, and it was clear from the onset that we were really well positioned to partner together on something like this. In terms of our priorities coming into it, as Rice mentioned, we have a very diverse list, so we feel a strong responsibility to our society partners and to maintain and support the diversity of that list. Of course, revenue continuity, and to the extent that we can ensure cost neutrality, we are certainly trying to facilitate both of those as best as we can. And I think as such, we see read and publish as a viable model to be able to do this. It enables us to start the transition of subscription funds into publishing, but also from our perspective, again, going back to this support of a very diverse list and communities that we feel strongly about continuing to support. And I think the last piece of that is a rather collegial and collaborative spirit that all of this it's really critical that you find a partner that's willing to work with you and have some really frank and open discussions and continue that dialogue in a meaningful way. Because I think that all of this is pushing us to look at our workflows and pull back the curtains on both sides and learn things that we probably didn't have to think as closely about before. So really making sure that you're finding that relationship that enables an open partnership, to keep using that word open. So from there.
So I can just, I'll just speak quickly to the priorities on the UC end of this. And I'm not going to go through each of these in depth because, like Rice mentioned, a lot of these could be their own talk, right? But we had a lot of priorities around how we saw sustainable implementation working that we wanted to work towards. So things like focusing on engaging the authors and making sure that all authors are able to participate, that authors have a consistent experience, so authors in January don't see something then different than authors in December would, right? We also had some pretty particular desires regarding finances and thinking about things like cost containment for predictability of budgeting, things like quickly transitioning our investment from supporting subscriptions to supporting open access publishing. And as Rice was mentioning, the idea that we're trying to incorporate grant funding through author participation to help sort of make this a more sustainable model, particularly for research-intensive institutions like ourselves. And then, like Jen was saying, sort of these last two kind of match on each side, but we're really looking to show some leadership in this area and help guide the transition. And as such, we're interested in participating in pilots that allow for experimentation, allow for a lot of learning and iteration so that we can improve upon these approaches moving forward. So of course, realizing that there's strategic alignment and seeing these lists of priorities, we can't just snap our fingers and produce an agreement, right? There's a lot of strategy involved in sort of talking about these and figuring out how to get to that point, that we're working on an agreement that we're both excited to implement and excited to move forward with. I think the red text at the bottom here really gets at the core of how I feel that should be working, which is that we need to build our agreement focused on the alignment that we do see, and then work on providing the flexibility that we need to for the differences in priorities that maybe made themselves apparent on the previous slide. So like Jen was saying, that starts with really holding frank discussions with each other and really sharing our data and our information and our strategies and our priorities so that we can understand where each side is coming from, and build from those places of alignment. Right, and then we seek those alignment, those alignment of priorities to build an agreement around. So we sat down, we realized we were in agreement on wanting wider dissemination of research, on wanting to adapt to this world that's changing, on wanting to lead the transition. So once we reach those agreements, then we can start to think about, okay, so how do we collaborate to figure out how to address those priorities that maybe aren't quite as in alignment. And so I've put up a couple examples here. One particular example is this idea of the author workflow that might incorporate grant funding, right? That wasn't necessarily in Cambridge's workflow, but being that it was a priority for us, Cambridge was willing to build that into our model so that we could experiment with that workflow and move forward. Conversely, with Cambridge's responsibility to their societies, that meant that certain society journals might not immediately be able to transition to allowing open access in their journals. And while our priority that I showed on the previous slide was 100% open access or 100% availability of open access, we sort of respected that difference that Cambridge has responsibilities to their societies that they couldn't be as flexible on. And so that's why, as you saw from the first slide, we start off with about 80% of journals having this option. I think one interesting aspect of this particular agreement is the timeline, because it was really kickstarted by some conversations between folks at CDL and Cambridge at last year's Charleston conference. And that really got things moving quickly. So shortly after that, we sort of traded proposals about what we thought might be a workable agreement. But that initial conversation really showed the alignment that we had. And helped get this moving. And by mid-April, we had signed a memorandum of understanding for this agreement that we were both excited about working towards and implementing. So we really started work on implementation in the spring and the summer, working on developing communications to our authors from both ends, both from us within the libraries and from Cambridge, and also developing the workflow that we're trying to implement. And we finally went live in the middle of September. So the first phase of implementation has gone live, and we've made at least a couple dozen papers open access through this already. And efforts are continuing to develop the sort of next phase of implementation that will really get at this author participation workflow that we're trying to implement. But I thought it was exciting that this started last year at the Charleston conference, and now 1 year later, we're back here telling you about this really exciting model that we've worked towards just in that year.
So taking it a step back now that we are in November and things are firmly in place, we'll just sort of rewind to around April or spring of this year when we had our signed MOU and we all took a step back and said, okay, we've got all of this stuff in front of us, now what? Where do we go? And I think what's been really interesting about these kinds of agreements in particular is the measure of success is so different than what we're used to. So we all hopped on a call, the calls that sort of seem to keep growing in size as more and more people get involved and need to be involved. But this initial call was about 5 or 6 of us, I think, and one of the first things we did was try to identify all the different people that would potentially need to be involved in this project and getting it off the ground. And from our end, it really meant getting a very cross-departmental participation up and running rather quickly. I think truth be told, we're still learning about how to do that and who should be involved and at what point. But throughout the course of this, I think we're keeping really close tabs on that and trying to make notes about the whole process. And we've talked about an assessment plan. But overall, I think the most remarkable thing about this is how even within organizations, we need to learn more about what each other are doing to better be able to bring these things to life.
Yeah, and just from the UC end on this, we had sort of a similar challenge of figuring out who were the right people to bring into the room on this. So we really had leadership coming from California Digital Library, which makes sense because we're sort of the central organization at the University of California that handles the system-wide journal contracts and investments of this nature. But it didn't need to stop there, and we didn't want it to stop there because we wanted our campuses to be participants in this process too. And so we built this implementation group to help think about this and other agreements that is made up of participants from various campuses. So Rice, for example, is on that group along with participants from several of the other campuses at the UC system. Both to sort of advise us in CDL about the central efforts from a campus perspective, and also to share in some of the work because there's a lot of work that goes into this. A subgroup of that was developed to focus just on author communications and used a communications professional from one of our campuses to also engage in that. I think thinking about how to talk to authors and researchers about these types of agreements is really an important concept. And so we focused a lot on that. And then certainly we brought in other specialists that we identified from across the system as needed. It's important to note that while this was the first agreement that we're working on implementing, we at UC have been thinking about these types of transformative agreements for a while and had developed some business requirements previously before we knew what publisher we would be starting an implementation with. So a lot of this is really author experience focused, right? How do we engage authors to help them understand the process, help them know what their choices are, and help them make the choices that they're intending to make? We also did a fair bit of thinking about how the actual author payment workflow might work. Rice was mentioning, we were talking about the idea of asking authors to contribute to the publishing fees if they have grant funding available. But not contribute the whole cost, but rather to split that cost with the library. Right? That entails a couple different steps that we understood might be different than what publishers are currently doing, and might require some effort to implement. And in thinking about that ahead of an agreement with Cambridge, we were thinking about whether a publisher needs to develop that themselves in their own local system, whether they need to engage a payment provider or a payment service provider to work on that, or if maybe we needed to build something that could be implemented in these types of agreements. And so what this really helped us do, even in advance of having these targeted discussions with Cambridge, was understand what our own requirements are and really get our own priorities straight. And then once we did have an agreement in place with Cambridge, we were able to use that to convey to Cambridge what our priorities are around this particular area.
Thank you very much. Hi everyone, my name is Andrew Sykes and I'm Marketing Director for Strategic Projects at the Press. And I've become closely involved, as Jen said, I'm one of the many people who've been sucked into this project. Willingly, I have to say, it's been incredibly interesting. Just to take your point, Matt, I think CUP also were thinking along similar lines ahead of us, receiving your proposal and taking those conversations forward. We also have a strategic focus on driving an open future, and we see it as a key part of our research publishing business. And we're working on a range of initiatives to move our journal business from obviously a subscription-based model to a largely OA-based model. And through some dialogue with some existing RMP customers in Europe and with our authors, our author base, we'd identified a number of areas where we needed to invest to help us achieve our goals. Most of them were around developing our operations essentially from the bottom up, because really we're taking a system that has been built over decades, maybe even centuries in some cases, to support a subscription model. And there are some fundamental differences that we needed to look at to scalably do the same thing in an open world. So we're currently running a number of technology and infrastructure projects, many of which sit in these three key areas here. Be that looking at how our metadata is gathered, stored, and flows through our systems to support an OA workflow, specifically a read and publish workflow. Or be that about ensuring that the customer experience that authors have in their end-to-end publishing journey with us is an excellent one. Because in a read and publish model, and an OA model more generally, how we publish is as much of a sales proposition for us as what we publish. We're moving from being content providers to providing a broader service in the research lifecycle. So, as we got into some of these practical discussions that have been mentioned, we quickly realised that actually, as has been said, a lot of those priorities were really quite shared, and that made a lot of those discussions reasonably easy. So I think a key point in our discussions about workflow was around May, when we demoed a sort of deep dive into the article publishing workflow that an author goes through the press. And we demoed all the steps that the author takes, right from the sort of preparation of their manuscripts, submission to one of our journals, the peer review process, and the interactions they have there, the ultimate decision, and assuming that the article is accepted, then onto the payment process and the publication of the article on Cambridge Core, and the sort of follow-up stuff there. So I think UC were really keen to see that at each of those steps, what their authors would be seeing and what experience their authors would have. And equally, we were really keen to get some direct feedback from customers on an element of our business that really librarians had no cause to be interested in, really, in a subscription model. So it was really quite insightful for us to get some honest feedback. I'll say no more than that. So that workshop gave us a really good platform to then work on refining how we comms out to UC authors at all points of their journey with us. And there were kind of two key areas that we focused on. One was, sorry, if you just slip back one slide, thank you. One was how we signpost to authors that they have eligibility to publish their paper OA. And that involved, banners, text, pop-ups on the various platforms that an author passes through. And then also, and we worked collaboratively on the wording of those messages and came to some good compromises. Similarly, we addressed wording for UC authors on the various emails that go out from Scholar One, our OPR systems, from RightsLink, from our production systems, to encourage OA submission, OA taking up of their eligibility. I will actually say as well as the comms piece, another big part for all of us, for both of us really, was the payment process. We already partnered with RightsLink to process our APCs, and they were keen to work closely with us and with UC as a kind of three-sided project team to implement Agreement Manager, which is their tool for processing payments in a read and publish model. And I think it's been a largely fruitful collaboration, and it has been very collaborative. Lots of three-way calls, lots of discussion, agreement, and compromise on all sides, I think. RightsLink aren't up here, but I think they have benefited probably from getting some live testing of their system and direct customer feedback. We've certainly benefited from being able to get right in there and spec something that meets our needs and our customers' needs. And hopefully you guys from UC have found it a very useful exercise too, and that you can, it's got you to the table that you previously might not have got to. So a couple of thoughts really from me on what we've learned so far, and it's an ongoing learning process. I think to reiterate from our side the importance of doing this in a team environment, both within the press itself, breaking down some of those traditional silos between sales, production, our platform, our editorial teams, marketing, but also with our customers. I also think, as Jen has said, in Cambridge's example of Cambridge, the breadth of our list has given us a particular challenge, most of our science and sort of harder social science journals were quite, they're already set up to be adapted to a deal like this. But a lot of our smaller humanities titles, many of which we publish for learned societies, they're not set up for this at all. Many of them still use paper-based submission systems. In some disciplines, open access is still something that is sort of maybe feared, certainly questioned. So there's a big education piece for us and our editorial teams working with those partners, which is going well at the moment, and we're converting as many as we can to reach that 100% number. And then I think finally, before I hand over to the next slide, it's allowed us to, working this way has allowed us to answer some questions about how scalable these kind of deals are for us. And I think the groundwork that we've laid so far really puts us in a good position to work with more partners in the future.
So in contrast with most times when we might sign a contract with someone like Cambridge, this really introduced a lot of changes that we had to socialize with our campuses, because they were going to see new options. They were going to be defaulted into new options as they went to publish with Cambridge. And we'd done a lot of kind of conceptual work about open access. Open access is a huge issue at the University of California. We have a diverse faculty, so I'm not going to say that 100% of our faculty hold any opinion, name a topic. But there's broad support for open access, but then how does this play out in real life? How is this going to impact me? And of course, we get new faculty and new graduate students every year, so someone just joining a campus might be coming in midstream and have a lot of questions about what they're seeing, especially if they've published with Cambridge before, and they would now be seeing potentially a new workflow. So this is where a lot of the folks who are on campuses worked with CDL to make sure that we could both educate librarians across the system and library employees so that we all knew what was going on, and then also that we could appropriately reach out to, depending on the campus, faculty who might have a strong history of publishing with Cambridge, or who seem that they're working in fields where they're likely to publish with Cambridge in the near future, as well as kind of just some general information for all faculty to be able to reach. So next steps on the UC side. So we've got a couple of things. Within this Cambridge agreement, there's some work to be done still. So outreach to authors and potential authors. Campuses, I think, are moving at different paces. We have a 10-campus system and quite a diversity of size within the group, even though we're all major research universities. Also continued workflow development, so we're still working with Cambridge and with RightsLink to implement the shared payment, shared cost sharing system, as well as all the messaging that would go with that so that people understand what they're looking at when they're asked. As well as looking at assessment, so what is the author uptake? What are there things that we could do to increase author uptake if folks choose to publish behind a paywall? Did they understand what they were doing? Do they understand that the library can pay for it if they don't have research funds? There's a lot of, we want to make this as easy as TurboTax, and it might take a little while to get there, and we're happy to iterate. Sorry. And then obviously the University of California is very committed to working with publishers at all sizes to help in transitions to open access. This is not the same journey for every publisher, and that's okay. So we're not trying to be prescriptive about what open access might look like in the future. It doesn't all have to be gold APC-based open access. And in fact, we have a lot of parallel initiatives, including hosting some open access journals through our e-scholarship system. But yeah, and then also supporting other libraries. So if there are librarians in the room where your institution is at a tipping point where you want to have a conversation with someone about a transformative arrangement, or you're just at a thinking stage, we have some things to support you at whatever step you might be.
Thanks. And I mean, for CUP, sort of more of the same, really. Continuing support for Read and Publish. That's the model that we think works best, certainly for us, but also for a lot of our partners. and as I referenced, preparing all of our journals for an open future. So we've got as many routes to OA publishing as possible. The phase 2 work is proving interesting and comes with some challenges, but we're definitely game for that. And I think the last 2 points really, ongoing investment in the end-to-end journey that our authors have with us. As I said earlier, that journey is part of the sales negotiation now, and making that as seamless and as user-friendly as possible is absolutely key for success. And how we market as well will change, because obviously there's an increased focus on driving submissions, but thinking about how we drive submissions in partnership with the institutions that we sign read and publish deals with will be a big focus for us too.
So, your homework. So as I mentioned, the University of California, we've chosen to be a bit out in front of some of these open access issues in terms of the United States, which means we're only about 3 years behind Europe. So depending on where you and your library is, there are some different items available through our Office of Scholarly Communication website for either developing your vision or how to work with a publisher. It depends on where you are in your process, but I encourage you to explore that. And then we wanted to talk a little bit about what you might expect if you were going to go down a road. So if you're talking with a publisher or you have a contract that's up in December and you're like, I'm totally going to go do this, just so that you, what to expect when expecting OA. So first of all, you're going to need a communication strategy for your campus. So this is, faculty might be already on board or not, but even if they're already on board, it is going to make some changes for them. And it's important to have a communications plan where you can walk people through that and help them to understand the choice that they're making. And you may need to therefore know, depending on who you're working with, who on your campus has been publishing where. And obviously there's some tools out there to help you poke around a little bit. Depending on the publisher you're working with, they might be able to share with you kind of a publishing history. And then, Andrew and Jen both alluded to the fact that they've been talking to our authors all along, and we had never seen or looked at, and unless you have tenure stream librarians yourself, you don't see these publishing systems and what is being said to faculty about their journey through the publishing system. And it was really great to be able to partner and look at that language and suggest some changes that might help clarify the choices that faculty are making and what's happening to them. I will say there's a little bit of like who is eligible to participate. So we took a pretty broad view at UC in going down this, and we're kind of assuming that anybody who is got a peer-reviewed article ready to publish, that we would like to pay we would like that to be open access. So if there's some like adjunct faculty or visiting faculty or something, there's some weird person that has a UC email address, we're pretty good with that. But that's maybe not going to be true for everyone. So there might be some kind of reflection on that. And then in the case of Cambridge, our deal was retroactive to the beginning of 2019. So there were already some articles published that kind of retroactively fell into this agreement, and we had to kind of sort out how to handle that. There might be some one-time work if you're going to do a series of these, as I hope you will. I do encourage that the library with your faculty kind of identify your values and what's important to you in these agreements, because it's going to become important as you sit down with a publisher to kind of map out what does open access look like, and is Gold APC what's right for you, or do you want to have a different kind of arrangement depending on the publisher, depending on the discipline, depending on your faculty, depending on your budget. And then depending on how you architect this and how big your campus or your consortium is, what is the governance structure for these kind of publishing arrangements? Who can actually broker a deal and say, yes, this does conform to enough to the vision and the values that we established that we're going to assign this. I'll say this is something that we're going through right now. We are courting a lot of publishers on open access, and and people, publishers come to us with all kinds of different shaped deals, and we have to wrestle with, well, okay, is this close enough to what we're looking for, or how do we get it there? But who gets to decide is going to become important, and it might not be the university librarian. It might not be the head of your acquisitions budget the way it might have been in the past. You might have just signed a deal because you have that delegated responsibility, and maybe it's not that simple now. You know, maybe somebody from the faculty has to weigh in on it. What counts as an article? A lot of kinds of stuff go into these journals. You know, letters to the editor, editorials. There's book reviews, all kinds of things. And what is open access? What is and what is not? You know, I think we focus a lot on research articles, but there's a lot of other stuff. And then I hope that UC isn't going to be the only folks to figure out that there's a lot of research money at play here that you could use to set up a split payment model and encourage some cost sharing between the faculty and the library. So that might be something to think about. So just like to take a step back, like how might you do this for yourself? It isn't zero work, but it is really gratifying work because you are going to change things. Moving from I had a talk the other week where somebody said, oh, we're moving to a pay-to-play system. And I said, no, we're already in a pay-to-play system. We're changing who's paying and who's playing. But we're already in a pay-to-play system. You're going to change the world in terms of who can read the output of your faculty and the reach that they have in terms of the general public and such. So it's very gratifying work. But there is a lot to do, and there's a lot of, you got to figure out who all is going to be involved, how deep is your bench, how big of an agreement can you take on if you're going to be the first one with a particular publisher, because they're going to need a strong partner if you're going first, or maybe even second with a publisher. I don't know, because there's a lot to learn. But I encourage you to go down this road. So before we get to questions, I was supposed to say at the beginning that this is being recorded. So your question would be recorded, just so you know. And if you do have a question, can you please use the microphone so that it does get recorded, and so those who are viewing this afterwards have the full opportunity to hear your question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Amy Harris from the MIT Press, and I was curious to know if you're planning on extending this agreement to books, monographs, or even trade books.
I mean, maybe. I don't know. The Davis campus is involved in TOME, which some of you may know. So TOME is ARL, AUP, someone else. There's a partnership around trying to make monographs also open access, so it's toward an open monographic ecosystem. And it's had great results so far. Folks sometimes ask me about will the money work out on the journal side, and I feel like it will. And will the money work out on the monograph side? I'm less sure about that. But I'm happy to talk to whoever wants to talk to me about open access monographs. But I don't know that we've had explicit conversations with Cambridge about going down that road.
Thank you.
But talk to me after if you want.
Just to add a point on that, really, I think it sort of feels inevitable that at some point monographs will have some form of OA output, just because of the nature of the work that's in them. And we, as a press, publish a lot of monographs. And I don't think we're ready yet to really tackle the implications of open access for that chunk of our list, that chunk of our business. But I wouldn't say that we're close to it.
Yeah, and in some ways, monographs offer different challenges because scholarly monographs are largely already in what I might call academy-owned infrastructure. So the university presses are kind of already again, going back to kind of the values earlier, they're already largely in alignment, and some of the presses are running at a loss right now, so they might be quite willing to explore a different revenue stream, or it's kind of a different animal, but there are some initiatives trying to take that on, and I think you're aware of them. Yeah. Microphone, please. Sorry, that kind of mic.
Hi, Frank Helwig, Frontiers UK. Question regarding this term transformative agreements. Does the University of California have a definition what that is? I mean, there are some out in Europe, maybe.
I would say we don't have an explicit definition. Like I can't really point you to a website where it specifically says what that is, but that's sort of our kind of overarching term for these types of agreements that are including access to content and payment for open access publication. And so on our Office of Scholarly Communications website, we use the term quite a bit, and there might be some ad hoc definitions of it on there that could help, but I would say it's not a clearly defined term for us in the way that people are clearly defining things like read and publish versus publish and read versus offsetting agreements, things like that.
I think we're trying to use a different turn of phrase than just saying open access, because there are a lot of publications that already allow green open access, which is I guess I'll speak for myself, not for the university at the moment. I would consider that not to be a transformative agreement. It's like a 10 years ago idea of how we can move open access forward. And green open access has not been unsuccessful, but for my taste, it hasn't been successful enough. The progress has been too incremental for me.
So Jason Price from Scalp Library Consortium. Rice, I want to challenge.
I'm shocked you have a question.
I want to challenge you a little bit on that point, actually. So maybe address the last one a little bit. So I've been learning lately that the definition of transformative agreement is very broad here in the U.S. and I think much more specific in Europe. To the extent that our definition of a transformative agreement is taking funding, at least some funding, that used to be applied to reading and to access, and shifting some of that funding toward open publication, that if an agreement takes dollars and applies them in that way, then it is transformative to some extent. And I do think that the green open access approach, though it has not had the effect for many libraries that we might have hoped, part of that is because it's really hard to get faculty publications into institutional repositories. And I think it's a reasonable suggestion to say that for consortia or libraries where it doesn't necessarily make sense to go the gold route, that if our agreements and the amount of money that we're currently paying to read can take some of that money and turn it into delivery of those author-accepted manuscripts directly to our repositories, so all of our authors who are part of those institutions. If we can populate institutional repositories in that way, that is another way to really make a transformative agreement happen in ways that get past a lot of the challenges that Green OA has faced in the past.
It's not the path I would follow, but to me, like institutional repositories, you're setting up a parallel infrastructure that shouldn't be necessary. You're creating an additional place where people have to look to find the open access version, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, at some level, that's got to be paid for, and it strikes me as like colossally inefficient. Like the system of record ought to be open, and the official version of the article ought to be open. But I'm not here to be an evangelist. But if you buy me a drink later, I can I can hold forth at length on this topic. But yeah, I think, you know, for journals that aren't there yet, and again, like we got a broad range of perspectives on open access and who's ready, and scholarly societies that are just not there yet. And so green open access, I'm not saying go home and turn off your institutional repository today, because we're just not there yet. But when I think about like what world do I want to live in 10 years, I think fewer institutional repositories. Now there's some disciplinary repositories that like have some real traction. So Archive is a great example, I think, there. But I don't know, like, should, you know, Podunk Community College stand up an IR for the research articles that it's faculty rights? I don't know. Like, I feel like the money is better used at changing the minds of scholarly societies or whatever. But it doesn't mean we can't do both. And if you're like, whatever you're doing right now, everybody, to make open access available is good. It's just like, I don't, and as I think about like where we want to be in 10 years, yeah, I would pivot. Yep.
I think just to kind of circle back to the question about what is a transformative agreement, I think more broadly speaking, for me, it just feels like this is it. We have to do something. So this is a means to start. This is a means to get creative and think about doing things differently. There is no one great solution at this point. I don't think the transformative model is even really a thing on its own. I think there's lots of flavors and sizes of what it will be and what it needs to be, especially if we're going to get forward. So I guess just more broadly, it feels like a call to action in some ways. Yeah.
I mean, maybe I can also suggest something, because this term currently gets a lot of hype. It has a positive connotation. Nothing against this, but other terms and also other types of agreements may be a bit overshadowed, other approaches, I may say. And I read the announcement for the tipping point workshop you organized, and I read a definition of transformative agreement I loved, because it was focusing on transforming the scholarly communication system. It was not limiting it to transforming money workflows and publication portfolios within one legacy publisher portfolio, and that's how the term is used these days. And what are we transforming there? We transform the relationship of one institutional consortium with one legacy publisher, I'm afraid to say. I don't think this is really very progressive.
Well, I mean, maybe we can agree to disagree. You got to start somewhere. University of California is huge. If we buy things as a 10-campus system from you, publishers in the room, we're your largest North American customer, probably. And like, we got some weight to throw around, and we're trying to throw it around right now. And I think trying to move toward this, we're trying to, for us, we have a deep bench to be able to work with Cambridge and like develop these workflows and give them feedback and be on a conference call once a week, you know. And Cambridge, in some ways, only has to do this work once. They're very motivated to go out and find other libraries. I think once we get through phase 2 of this implementation. And I mean, why Cambridge? In some ways, it was the alignment of the values and how quickly we could come to an agreement with them, because our values were a little more aligned. I think they just were a little more eager to jump off the deep end and into the deep end, whatever that would be. I mean, there's, you know, if you think about like the big 5 publishers, and would this be, quote unquote, a more exciting talk if we were talking about one of those big 5? Maybe, but you know, those are, you got a big ship and a small rudder there, and asking a publisher to change the whole concept of their revenue stream is a big ask. It is an ask we should be making, and it is an ask we are making. But Cambridge, I think in part because of their size, they're big enough to be able to grapple with these issues, but they're small enough to be able to turn a little more quickly. So I see this as a first step, and maybe it doesn't rise to everybody's vision of what transformative would be, but there's kind of no looking back now. I mean, I think Cambridge is is committed. I don't know how they would like rewind and say, oops, never mind. Can you actually subscribe? So, I mean, Cambridge is down this path with us, and I think that is, to me, that is very exciting. And, there's a few other publishers that have partnered with North American folks, including MIT, to go down a path like this. And those are all very exciting to me. I think I see them all as wins, and I see them all as really important wins. So, I don't know. But I hope each of you will be at Charleston next year talking about the transformative arrangement, or transformative agreement, for whatever definition you have of a transformative agreement, because that is where it happens. And if I need a new turn of phrase, I'm happy to call it something else. I'm more interested in kind of building some momentum, and it starts with one step. I think we're at time. Yes? So we probably should let you go to your next session, but we will hang out.